Okay, well, welcome. For this evening, I would like to speak about Ewan and some of the work that he has done, that uh, some of the stories from his career. Only a small slice, of course, across an amazing career. But I wanted to use this opportunity to really highlight just how incredible Ewan was as a naturalist, the connections that he would make between often very different parts of earth science and biology, and just his breadth of knowledge really is what I wanted to showcase here. And of course, the timing of this comes as a remembrance. We, of course, said goodbye to Ewan last November. This is a photo of Ewan that comes from right at the start of the stories that I'm going to be telling this evening. So this is an image that Rob Bierlin actually provided for the tribute volume for Ewan. I'm going to speak about that tribute volume in just a few slides' time. But here we are. Here is Ewan conducting a field excursion in 1983, right at the beginning of his career at the University of Otago, freshly arrived into the Department of Geology. I will say that, of course, Ewan was dear to us, but some who are joining may not have, had the pleasure of meeting Ewan, may have known Ewan, or may have heard about him in later years, because I was delighted to hear that we had some interest from Geoscience students in this presentation. So Ewan was many things, of course, but one thing in particular that he is most famous for is his work on as a vertebrate paleontologist on fossil penguins, fossil cetaceans in particular. And he did this from his role as a professor in the Department of Geology at the University of Otago. There's a lot more to go into about Ewan and his life, but that I think is a nice starting point for where I'm going to pick up and what I'm going to be talking about with this presentation. And so I could quite happily have designed a talk, and in fact, that was the first draft of this talk, just about Ewan's penguins. But there aren't that many of us who can digest an hour on fossil penguins. And so I decided to take the opportunity here to broaden this. We understand and, of course, know that Ewan was, yeah, as I mentioned, very famous internationally for his work on fossil whales and dolphins and penguins as well. But these are actually fairly narrow clades. And so the figure I am showing here is just a whole lot of words and some phylogeny, and it's a representation of evolutionary relationships of vertebrates. And I've just put this figure here to show that there's a lot more to vertebrate life in particular than whales and dolphins and penguins. And Ewan actually did work quite broadly across this vertebrate tree of life. Now, Ewan actually worked very broadly across many domains of life. He was a marvelous micropaleontologist, expert with plants, but I have narrowed this down a little bit just to focus on vertebrates. And so that's where I want to go this evening. I want to tell some stories about some case studies, some projects that were important to Ewan, where he made some amazing contributions, and that these case studies are scattered across this tree of life for vertebrates. And so I'm going to be presenting a case study on fish, on amphibians, on mammals, reptiles, and birds this evening, walking through them one after the next. And at this point, I do want to say that I am coming at this. So I'm a witness to these stories, but I have chosen projects or case studies, stories that I'm not a character in. So I'm going to be approaching this as if I am reviewing this work and describing this work to you, but it's not something that I'm personally involved in. So what that means is that there might be a few details that I do miss, and there may be a couple of points that I perhaps do get wrong. And if that is the case, I encourage you to to chime in and correct me. So very happy that we get the record straight on this. But at the same time, some of you will be characters in these stories that I'm telling. The first one that I'm going to begin with, which will be our reptile story. Just looking through our list of people here, Daphne at least will have some knowledge about our reptile stories. But if anyone has anything to chime in with to add, then please feel free. But yeah, that is the structure of what I want to work through this evening. I have these 5 stories to tell. They are not, as we can see, ordered in any kind of evolutionary sense. They're actually structured in terms of key points across Ewan's career. So from earlier in his career towards later on. And our very first story actually begins at around the same time that photo was taken, that one that I just showed before, of a Ewan who was right at the beginning of his career at the University of Otago, contemplating vertebrate fossils. Before I get to that case study, I do want to mention that I've brought forward a lot of information, taken a lot of information from the published studies describing these fossils, but I have also been working through the anecdotes, the stories about Ewan that people have contributed for this volume. So if you are unfamiliar with this cover, with this volume, this is a tribute that was prepared by Ewan's friends, Ewan's colleagues, and it is actually available. So if you don't have a copy of this, it is available as a digital version. And I do have a link here, but if you are curious and following this up and are unable to find it, then you can just reach out to me. I'm available at the Paleontology at Geoscience New Zealand website, but you can track me down. And then I can connect you through to this truly delightful volume. So I have been drawing on this a little bit, the content this evening. Okay, so let us begin. We are here with the first of these 5 case studies, and this is, of course, Kaiwhi kia Kātiki. So this is the Matakaya shag point plesiosaur, an incredible fossil that was first discovered in the early 1980s. It was found by a local member of the public before Ewan would arrive at the University of Otago. So Ewan would start in 1983, and this would become one of the very major fossils that Ewan would work on right in his early career stage. It is a marvelous specimen. I'm going to talk through exactly about its contributions, the fossil's contributions to the New Zealand fossil record in just a moment. But what I do have here is a rather odd picture that doesn't show the plesiosaur fossil, but this is actually the first frame in a wee YouTube video that I'll play in a moment. So many of us, of course, are familiar with this specimen. We have seen it perhaps many times, for it is on display at Otago Museum in the Southern Lands Gallery. But if you haven't had the opportunity to visit that gallery, to visit Otago Museum, then this is a really nice little video, which is just available on YouTube, which shows the specimen. So this comes to us from a content creator called Travels with Philip. It's titled A Plesiosaur Fossil. And so if I'm in here and I play this video, I'm going to pan up, and we're going to see in the background here this just absolutely marvelous specimen. It has an artificial head sitting up here, but we see this great span of vertebrae down through the back and the traces of the pelvic girdle and hind limb. So rather unusual shape and rather unusual preservation in this fossil. It was found and is a concretion collected in several pieces and then essentially cracked open to discover that it was a natural mold in many places of a fossil. It's laid out wonderfully so you can get a grand sense of the size, the scale of this animal. So this is the shag point plesiosaur. This arrived to Ewan. Ewan was alerted to it very early on in his career, as I mentioned. And it comes, of course, from Matakaya, from Shag Point. So for those again, who are unfamiliar, here we are down around Dunedin, and so this location is up the coast some way. And this image that's being shown here is from the study that Ewan and Arthur Cruikshank would present on this specimen in 2002. So here's our timeline on this. Fossil discovered in possibly around 1982. Ewan begins working on it in 1983 with several others. Rallies many people to help collect the specimen. Several were involved in preparing this, but it would take essentially 2 decades for the collection, the preparation, the description. So during this time, Ewan would form his collaboration with Arthur, and eventually this specimen would materialize after quite a time. And it's a large specimen. It required the development of a lot of new infrastructure for the department, but it was a real, early and important milestone in Ewan's career. And it had an impact, of course it did, on New Zealand paleontology. So this specimen straight away increased the diversity of Mesozoic Zealandian vertebrates. So Mesozoic animals that lived during the age of the dinosaurs, and vertebrates, these animals that had backbones, and the ones that were living around this fragment of Gondwana, this Zealandia. So Ewan and Arthur would present this fossil. They would give it a brand new name, this Kaifekia kartiki, and this is a name that has stood the test of time. So what has happened since this publication is this fossil has actually been studied intensively alongside many other plesiosaur fossils, and evolutionary relationships between plesiosaurs have actually changed a great deal, and certainly in recent years as well. Some of the original work that was done for this study has perspectives on this have changed a little bit. This for some of the terminology here, it was originally presented as being in one particular plesiosaur family. It now finds itself in another. But what's, I think, critical here is that this name has been preserved, Kaifekia kartiki. And what that essentially is telling us is that when this was first found, it was new to science. It was a novel contribution to the fossil record, not just of Zealandia, but of the world. And even after all of this analysis, it is still found to be the case that this is a novel and new piece of the fossil record, that the incredible effort that went into recovering and preparing, describing it, contributed to the world. And so I think this is a delightful piece of Ewan's reptile legacy. It has a few other accolades, so it is still the most complete Mesozoic vertebrate reported from Aotearoa. So if you are familiar at all, well, to the best of my knowledge, again, feel free to correct me on any point. But our Mesozoic age of dinosaurs fossil record from Aotearoa, from Zealandia, tends to be a little bit sparse, certainly compared to many of the Cenozoics, or the more recent material. And so it's actually very unusual in this country to have a large series of articulated bones, even if they are natural molds and not just preserving the original bone itself. So it was an amazing find, and its contribution has essentially stood the test of time. Because it was so detailed and so well preserved and well prepared, it wasn't just a record, so a line in a book somewhere. Again, Ewan and Arthur were able to really extract some meaningful insight from this fossil. And that's what this wee description is here. But let me just quickly paraphrase, because it has this flattened back to its head, and its eyes are sitting in a particular place, and it has rather aggressive teeth. It led the authors to make this inference that the jaw muscles point to catching and grasping fast-moving, medium, possibly large size, poorly armored prey. So they were really getting into what this animal would have been like as it lived in these fossils, in this fossil ocean, way back during the age of the dinosaurs. So this is Ewan's, I think, signature reptile contribution to the fossil record of Zealandia. Before I move across, I want to point out this wee quirk that I came across while taking a look into this one. This is another YouTube video. I'll play it in just a moment. This one comes to us from a content creator called Veloci, and the title of this is Kofikia is out now. So many of us have found fossils, and several of us have had the opportunity to describe and work on fossils. But there are not many of us who have then had those fossils turned into video game characters that people around the world can then pilot through Mesozoic oceans and take on and catch fish and do battle with other things. And that is very much this case here. So here we see an animated Kaifikia that is part of a video game that you too could now head away from this talk and go and download and play if that is your desire. And so I thought this was a neat contribution, an interesting part of Ewan's legacy. So I'm going to step across and talk about my next case study in just a moment. But if anyone has anything to add or anything to clarify or to correct, then please feel free to either chime in, or you're welcome to come back to me at the end of the presentation. Do I have any commentary, any additions? No? All right. I might come to you, Donald and Daphne, at the end to see if anything needs to be clarified here. But otherwise, I'll move on. I'm going to move on to our next story. And this is from a publication that would come out the year after the Kofikia study. So this is a study that's going to come to us from 2003. This is Fordyce et al. Now, let me just apologize for the blurriness of these images. I'm going to start with this one in the center, and we can see that it is a very blurry picture. This is the best resolution that I could find in the publication of this specimen. So it's a rather plate-like looking object with some ridges to it. Here is another photograph, and we can see it's also a little bit blurry. And now this photograph is from a website that is describing this very specimen, and it's just a picture that was put online, and here I've blown it up, so I've lost a bit of quality. So what I've got here is just sitting off to the side. It's just a rough outline to just convey the sense that what we are looking at is a relatively small, 50 centimeters, a relatively small object that has these ridges to it. That's our takeaway here. And this is the fossil. This is the whole fossil. So we've just gone from a beautiful articulated plesiosaur down to this. And this one has quite a story. So this is a specimen from Matoda. If you are unfamiliar, it's in the middle of nowhere in Southland. And apologies. If you are familiar with any Southland location. So here we are at Invercargill and Throne Bluff, and so it's sitting in around here. This is where this specimen was found, and it was found by Hamish Campbell. I'm going to read through this story in just a moment, but before I get there, this is text, and I'll have some images soon that have come from this article. So this article is titled Bones of Contention. It is an article from New Zealand Geographic from a 2008 edition of New Zealand Geographic. So it's written by Warren Judd and illustrated principally by Dave Gunson. There are illustrations from others in this as well. This was really the first major media release, the first time this story was really communicated to the public, and it was part of a beautiful series of descriptions of fossils, several of which Ewan had worked on. And so this description would come out around 5 years after this this article would come out about 5 years after the study. But here we go. On 24 November 1998, Hamish Campbell, who I don't think I have here this evening. I don't see. All right, correct me if I'm wrong. Hamish Campbell was carrying out field work beside Titiroa Stream on the eastern side of the lower Matoda River in Southland when he discovered a rock that showed a mold of fossil material. And the mold was ornamented with coarse ridges, as you've just seen, which initially looked like something from an ammonite shell, so one of these coiled shells where the animal lives in the final chamber. Further investigation showed that it wasn't an ammonite or a mollusk or a brachiopod or indeed any other sort of invertebrate. Vexed, not just curious or, at a bit of a loss. No. As presented here by Warren Judd, Hamish Campbell was vexed. He took the fragment to Ewan Fordyce, and then I think we have the world's most understated piece of punctuation. For it goes, he took the fragment to Ewan Fordyce, comma. And this comma, there's so much wrapped up in it, because it will then go on to say, who suggested it was similar to. Now, at this point in Ewan's career, he never worked on the specimen that I'm going to show you described. This would have been simply something that he would have seen in museums, read about as just part of his general interest in the fossil record, something that he would have come across during his preparation of lecture material, but not have any personal experience with. And so if you just think through all of the broad topics that you have encountered, well, that's essentially the body of knowledge that Ewan was consulting when he was brought that rather, innocuous ridged fossil. So vexed, he took the fragment to Ewan Fordyce, who suggested it was similar to ornamented dermal bones of Paleozoic and Mesozoic amphibians. So it's this incredible intuitive leap that gets made. So Ewan is now reflecting on this wonderful body of knowledge that he has stored up across his just deep interest in natural history and connects these pieces together. Ewan then becomes a bridge between Hamish, who discovered this, and Anne Warren, specialist in this particular group, who's working at La Trobe University at the time. She identified it as the quarter of the underside of the left clavicle of a 2-meter salamander-like amphibian known as a stereospondyle, essentially confirmed what Ewan had already figured out. So that same story is mapped out in the paper here. This paper, the paper actually will go on to say that Nick Mortimer was present. So Nick is part of this story too. But it is these three who will end up being the authors that are listed here. So pattern is a ammonoid-like thing, but it was Ewan who noted similarities with the ornamented dermal bones. So what is it that Ewan had figured out? So here is this ridged, lined structure before. And so this is what Ewan had done. He had connected it through to something that looks like this. Here, I've just taken this outline and I've overlaid it here. And this is one of these deeply ridged pieces of a pectoral girdle of an animal that had never shown up in the New Zealand fossil record prior to this point. And that didn't really have a strong fossil record in Australia either, but it was right on the money. So that fragment is actually, if you can follow the mouse at all, hopefully you can see that, but I can certainly describe it. There is this plate that is sitting in the shoulder region of this animal, and we can't actually see those ridges because they are facing towards the ground. They're on the ventral surface, but it is this piece that Hamish had found, that Ewan had identified, and that together those two had recruited the help of Anne Warren to describe. And it was remarkable. So that discovery and that recognition pushed back the age of tetrapods, which are animals with backbones that have 4 legs, pushed back the age of these animals, these tetrapods, for the New Zealand fossil record up to 250 million years ago. So this stands the test. This is still the oldest evidence we have for tetrapods in the New Zealand fossil record. And it turns out, I mean, it's exactly as you would expect, given the proximity of the Zealandia fragment to Australia as part of Gondwana, that they would have shared an amphibian fauna at the time, but it was essentially confirmation of that fact. So it's the oldest vertebrate that we have, and that is credited to this discovery, this recognition. I think that's really neat. So the Australian forms had a large head with eyes facing up and a large mouth with many needle-like teeth, rather short legs, and a sprawling gait. Possibly also the animal fed on land, although it could have only done so in damp environments where its skin would not dry out, and hence its amphibian nature. So at this point, in 2003, Ewan has just pushed back the tetrapod fossil record for New Zealand, along with Hamish Campbell and Warren, of course, to 250 million years. Do I have anyone who wants to add in anything there about this amphibian case study? I'm just going to make that offer at the end of each of these, and if you do want to speak up, then please feel free. I'm going to step forward, not too far in time, but this one is going to be my fish case study. And this one is especially important for a collaboration that this represents. So that the presentation this project that I'll talk about is the second of a series of projects, of collaborations, of papers that Ewan would work on with Mike Gottfried. And so this was, again, reasonably early in Ewan's career. And so they would form a career-long friendship. And so Michael Gottfried will actually show up in a couple of these stories as well. But this story is the giant moonfish. And this is now a fossil that is substantially younger in time than our previous ones. This is Cenozoic. And this is a fossil that comes from North Otago, from the Island Cliff location. This image that I have here is not the fossil location. I didn't have a photo of the fossil site, but it evokes the landscape. So we have these tall cliffs of Oligocene limestone, and Ewan and colleagues were scouting through these, prospecting through them, looking for fossils. And there was that work that led to the discovery of this next story. And this is, of course, Megalampris keysii, a giant moonfish or a giant opar. And the specimen was collected in 1995 by Ewan, by Andrew Grebneff, Brett Black, and others. But the reason I've included this story, Ewan worked on many fish across his career, several fish across his career. But I really like this one because this fossil was the lowest of 3 vertebrates recovered in a single excavation from a roughly half-meter thickness of limestone. 3 fossils. So the team identified one fossil at the surface, and I'm going to show that in just a moment. And then that led to further discoveries. And it goes like this. So in this fossil location, what was originally exposed at the surface was this. Again, hopefully you can see the mouse. Please let me know if you can't. I have in this figure from this paper describing, again, a specimen I'll talk about in just a moment, where these structures are rather large vertebrae from a giant mega shark, things like the very charismatic megalodon. Well, this is an early ancestor of this, the so-called Carcharodon angustidens, or Otodus angustidens, a big shark. So it was this that was at the surface, and these busy bees would then go about extracting and exposing that. There was a lot more to be found, several more vertebrae, and a whole lot of teeth. This fossil was incredible. It put these big sharks very early on into the Cenozoic record for North Otago. It was an incredibly complete specimen. It was a big deal. And so this was, and very early, this fossil shark represents an early collaboration between Ewan and Mike Gottfried. Wonderful. So this specimen gets collected up, and then the team notice that on the next level down is another fossil. And that next fossil is a skull of a dolphin, rather unusual dolphin, a very pointy-toothed dolphin. And this dolphin would actually contribute to Amber Costa's PhD thesis. So this one would then become very important as part of Ewan's training later on in his career. So this fossil would then be extracted again back in the 90s, lifted up and collected and stored away for later study. But after extracting that one, the team noticed that there was yet another fossil in the same site, in the same pit. And the fossil that they would find would introduce a whole new group into the New Zealand fossil record. And so that is what this specimen is sitting here. This is a rather large fish. We can see a 1 meter scale here from the paper. Tail is sitting through here. This is all the way up to the bones that are associated with the gills out through here. So that it doesn't have a beautiful preserved skull, but it certainly has some of the bones associated with the gills. And so that is able to establish a pretty confident length through here. So 3 fossils from one location, and each of them making major contributions. I have here an image of what one of these moonfish look like in life. This is a random picture off the internet. I don't know who this individual is or the person holding the fish, but this is one of these beautiful moonfish, and this is actually a relatively small one. They do get much bigger. A reconstruction was made, an image was made to represent Megalamprus, this giant moonfish. This, I can assure you, is a very meaningful image if you are familiar with the sizes of various fossil penguins, but I can point out that this is a representation of Kairuku, one of the giant penguins, and so that should help with a little bit of context. This was a very giant fish. This image was prepared by Giovanardi, so Simone Giovanardi, for a paleo art competition that he did. He wanted to capture some of the specimens that Ewan had worked on to represent Oligocene seas of Zealandia. So this fossil fish had been found, and to date, it is the largest bony fish in the New Zealand fossil record, so it was a major and serendipitous discovery. This animal in life would have been around 4 meters long, twice the size of living moonfish. And it added this group, so Lampriformes, also known as Lampridiformes, so if you're familiar with the study, you might see that term, but it added this group, this unusual, this very wacky group of fish to the New Zealand fossil record. So for a bit of context, these are some of these examples of these types of unusual fish. This is a group that are living today in the Mediterranean Sea, but we now know that they were appearing in the fossil record. At least a very large Megalamprus was turning up in the Oligocene of New Zealand, thanks to this amazing fossil that Ewan and team collected and that Ewan was involved in describing. Right. I'm going to step across and talk about our fourth of these 5 case studies, and this is our mammals. And this is a non-cetacean mammal story, and it actually begins with this specimen here. This is not a fossil that Ewan worked on, not one that he described, but certainly one that he was familiar with. So this is Steropodon. This, hopefully you can see, is a jaw, and it's a relatively small structure, a relatively small fossil. And this is an Australian specimen. This was described in the mid-80s, so shortly after Ewan had begun at the University of Otago, this had been described, and it was discovered at around the time that Ewan began working at the University of Otago. So that sort of gives you a bit of a timeline. The discovery, the announcement were very early on when Ewan was establishing himself at the University of Otago. So it's Australian. It was described by Mike Archer and friends, so Tim Flannery and Ralph Molnar and Alex Ritchie. And if you are not familiar with this specimen, hopefully you can see that it has a bit of a blue tint across it. There's a little bit of a green tint through here. And that is part of the charm of this. This is an opalized lower jaw of a mammal. So the bone that would have been originally present here has been replaced with silica. And that's interesting and important, but it's almost incidental. So this fossil is, when it was first reported, was Australia's first Mesozoic mammal. It was found in the earliest part of the late Cretaceous. So it's around 100 to 90 million years, so a little bit older than these maps that I'm showing here. These maps are from a recent paper by Dominic Strogan and colleagues, including James Crampton, who we have many people here. Anyway, a big team produced these maps. And what I want to call your attention to is, at the time that animal was alive, that Steropodon, Zealandia was, of course, still attached to the rest of Gondwana. It was really close to Australia. This arrow was pointing to the approximate location of Lightning Ridge, where that fossil would have come from. So there is, as again Ewan and others surmised, every expectation that whatever was living here potentially had a broader Gondwanan range, which logically raises the question, well, if these mammals, these monotremes were living across Gondwana at the time, then where were Zealandia's mammals? Why didn't we have our own populations of these things when Zealandia broke away from Gondwana? Why didn't we have a vicariant population? And this I know, was a topic of interest for Ewan. I know that because it featured in my 400 level coursework that I did with Ewan. I learned all about tribosphenic molars and other delightful mammalian things. But this idea really, it sat with Ewan for a while, and he would eventually develop a research program, some of the seeding work to start really teasing at this idea. And what Ewan would do is take that knowledge of that fossil and of other Mesozoic mammals that have been turning up across Gondwana, including some of the ones that Michael Gottfried had been working on, take his knowledge of geology, take his understanding of systematic processing of sediment to look for fossils. So connect together a lot of methodology, a lot of philosophy from across biogeography, from across geology, to develop the seed of a research idea. And this was a project entitled Seeking the Lost Mammals of Zealandia that Ewan was working on and perhaps 10 or so years ago, for several years. And so I'm going to cut to the chase here. That project didn't produce land mammal remains. So Ewan didn't find New Zealand's missing lost mammals of Zealandia. They might have found a crocodile. But what's really critical here is this foundational work was done. These are the shoulders of the giant that the next person will stand on to find that mammal tooth, if indeed it does exist. So I thought it was really wonderful, fundamental and foundational work that, yeah, it didn't produce dividends or as exciting a result as it potentially could have, but it may still do in time. So this is a story that I did want to mention. As best as I can tell, it is actually only summarized in this abstract, which is what this image is showing us here from the 2014 Geosciences meeting in New Plymouth. So this is the meeting abstract book that you can find online. And here's a wee summary of Ewan's results. And I haven't actually seen any other outputs from this project aside from this one. Again, happy to be corrected on that. But here Ewan was and team were working through some shallow marine sedimentary rocks that were not quite as old as Steropodon was, but were still Paleogene in age, searching for evidence of teeth and other things. So I thought a great investigation, and it's just sitting there for the next person to pick up and to carry forward. I thought this was a delightful tale. And again, you're welcome to chime in. And if not, I'm going to jump across into the last of these stories, these tales. And this is my birds example. And before I do, I will mention that now this study that I'm going to describe is actually part of a special issue that is being assembled at the moment. It's a special issue in the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand. It has a focus on fossil vertebrates from Zealandia. And as you might expect, because it is a study of fossil vertebrates that have essentially come from New Zealand, Ewan features prominently across many of these articles. So these are 3 that all have Ewan as co-authors of them. And this one in particular that I'm going to describe is no exception. So this is the ancient mariner albatross, and this is a fossil that comes from Ewan's second home. This is Hawes Quarry, the Otakaiki limestone quarry in, well, South Canterbury, right? This is an image not of Ewan collecting this fossil. This is simply another image of the same location. This was taken after the fossil was collected, but I really like this one. It evokes the location where a lot of Ewan's excellent work was done, but it also shows Ewan with this pioneering technique of using like a tungsten toothed chainsaw blade to cut this very soft limestone to extract these specimens out. So it's a great picture, and this comes to us from Sai, from his contribution to the tribute volume. In fact, the fossil that I'm going to talk about is actually a little bit younger than this horizon. This is from Mount Harris Formation rather than Otakaiki limestone. And it is about an albatross, and it was discovered incidentally. It's not something that was set out to be found. It was found during the excavation of a whale skeleton. Many people were involved in the discovery and subsequent collection of it, and they are all very wonderfully summarized and listed in the acknowledgements of that paper. But it was a really interesting specimen for a few different reasons. So here it is here, a nice summary of the bones that have been lovingly prepared. So we have a beautiful beak here. This is the top of the head. I've called your attention to this image here. This is just an enlargement of this section here. This is the distal end of the uppermost arm bone in the wing, so humerus. And we're looking at the same thing along the bottom here. This is this humerus bone, but it's also got the forearms. So humerus, radius, and ulnar, radius and ulnar. And the reason I've called this your attention to this is because of this little bump here, this little bump. And this little bump is the one that we can see in here. This little structure is important in albatrosses today for something called dynamic soaring. It's involved in one of 2 locking mechanisms. So albatrosses can lock their wings into place, and then they can perform a particular flight style, which is incredibly efficient. And this fossil was so well preserved that the researchers actually very carefully and closely studied the shape, the very precise shape of the structure here. And it led them to speculate whether or not this fossil, this very ancient albatross, may have also been capable of dynamic soaring. And so that wouldn't just push back the fossil record for this group into time, they would actually push back a behavior, a mode of locomotion into time. And so it has that significance to it as well. I do have another, and this is my last one, of these YouTube videos. So this is a video that's going to show dynamic soaring. If you're not familiar with it, it is really a magnificent thing that these birds do. So you can imagine here Ewan's ancient mariner albatross potentially, maybe, also doing the same thing. So this original video comes to us from Lynette Rudman, and Lynette does present a wonderful description. I don't think I've got her narrating this one, but I'll just quickly show that there are 4 phases to this locomotion if you're unfamiliar. So albatross is going to dive down close to the waves, and it's going to use the interaction between the wind and the surface to raise back up and curve around, glide back down towards the water, and then is going to raise itself back up again. So it's going to essentially take this S-shaped path up and down in association with the water, and it's just a very efficient way for these animals to move. And part of it, the way they're able to do that is because they have locked their arms into place. So that's fine and fun, but it's here that I really alerted to on this paper, and it is, yeah, it's interesting in that it is the earliest albatross that we now have for the Southern Hemisphere. So it really pushes back the record of an important group for New Zealand now, back in deep time. But it's this second point that I've got highlighted here, which I think is key. And this is, sorry, I keep losing my thing out of my ear. This is Ewan's second hint to us about the early origins of Zealandia as a seabird biodiversity hotspot. So if you are unfamiliar, the New Zealand region today is one of these biodiversity hotspots. Roughly a quarter of the world's seabird species live here, breed here, and a very large proportion of them are endemic, just occur here. So tiny part of the world, very important globally for seabirds. And the first hint that Ewan gave to us that was an ancient system, that we go back into deep time, and Zealandia has been important for seabirds for a long time, was his publication in 2006 with others, including Tetsuro Ando, presenting to us the earliest evidence for penguins. Penguins have been part of New Zealand, the Zealandia fauna, for basically since the day after the death of the dinosaurs. Well, this is this now second hint. Procelariforms, or albatrosses, are now pushed deeper into time. So not quite as far back as the Paleocene, but we now have albatrosses back into the Miocene. So really pushing our understanding well into deep time that New Zealand has been special for seabirds for ages. So that was my big takeaway from this study. So yes, though that is my walk through these 5 case studies, these non-penguin, non-cetacean case studies of Ewan's, walking across his career, showing just the incredible depth of knowledge that he had in terms of his biology and his paleontology, but as well as just more broadly. So I'm going to end that there. I look forward to any questions or discussion or any contributions that you might have, but thank you very much for listening.